Welcome back, history students, to our discussion on the Civil War continued. Last video, we got up to discussing the Confederate supply shortage and why the Confederacy was never able to solve that problem. One of the things that I mentioned last video was that some Confederate soldiers began deserting their army to go home and help their families because their families were begging them to come home because of hard times and supply issues. One of the solutions to deal with desertion was that the South could have enlisted slaves to serve as soldiers. But in the end, the South decided not to do this. President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy decided not to enlist slaves. And the main reason for that was the concern of arming slaves. The South feared if they armed the slaves would retaliate against their masters. And there would be slave revolts if the slaves were able to have access to weapons. That was the big fear of the South, and that was the reason why Davis waited to make a decision about using slaves. Now, let's think about how that could have happened, how they could have used the slaves into their benefit. You could argue that the South could have offered the slaves freedom if they were loyal soldiers at the end of the war. That could have been a way to avoid slave revolts. There's no guarantee that that would have been successful, but that's one of the things that the South could have done. And that might have helped them build up their army and deal with their issue of the soldiers deserting. At the very, very end of the war, in March of 1865, Davis decided to call for slave soldiers, but it was too late. The South had already lost the war by then, and they had surrendered in April of 1865. So the South did not use black soldiers. The North, however, did use black soldiers. The Secretary of War under Lincoln was Edwin Stanton, and in 1862 he called for African American men to enlist in the Union Army. And we did have African Americans serve in the U.S. military during the Civil War. Now, the Army was segregated, meaning that the black soldiers served in separate regiments than the white soldiers did. And our military was segregated based on race all the way up until World War II. And then after World War II, that was when the military became integrated. So, for many years, the U.S. Army was segregated. The first black regiments that the North used were very successful, and Northern leaders realized how valuable it was to enlist black soldiers. And probably one of the most famous regiments of black soldiers was Massachusetts 54th Regiment. And they were led by a white officer named Robert Gould Shaw. He was a Boston aristocrat, and he had that regiment of soldiers. In the spring of 1863, his unit headed for South Carolina. They went down to the South. They fought a larger Confederate army at Fort Wagner in July of 1863, and over 40% of Shaw's troops were hurt or killed, and Shaw himself was killed in that battle. Shaw and his men were viewed as martyrs for the North. They were really heroes. Before the war ended, around 179,000 African Americans had served in the Union Army, and 29,000 African Americans served in the U.S. Navy. Of those men who served in the U.S. military, 135,000 of them were ex-slaves, and 44,000 African American soldiers died to save the Union and defend their freedom. At the end of the war, 24 African American soldiers were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for bravery in battle. So not only did the North use black soldiers, but African American soldiers were a huge benefit to the North in the war and really helped the North win the war. This is a very famous sculpture in Massachusetts, up by Boston, of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. And if you look at that, and that's called a relief sculpture. It's kind of three-dimensional, but almost looks like a plaque, but it's large. You'll see on the horse is Robert Gould Shaw, and he is leading his regiment of African American soldiers. Now, I just want to bring up a current event issue right now. You know, with the Black Lives Matter movement that has been at the forefront of our society over the summer, there have been more and more Confederate statues that have been removed. There have been statues removed that people feel are disrespectful to African Americans and Native Americans. And this monument that I'm showing you right now, this is a picture from Creative Commons, has been scrutinized. And there are people who want this monument taken down. And they are upset that Robert Gould Shaw, who was white, is depicted on a horse above his soldiers when they were all equal comrades. And there are other similar statues that have been taken down or have been removed from public with similar types of images. So this statue might be removed at some point. Was created in the 1800s, and it was to commemorate the Massachusetts 54th and the fact that they sacrificed everything in the name of the Union and freedom. So that's that famous statue. So as of now, it's still in Massachusetts, but it might be removed and maybe replaced with something different at a later date. All right, so let's move into the last years of the war. In the spring of 1863, in Virginia, we have the Battle of Chancellorsville. Union troops tried to surround Lee's army. Lee divided his army and surprised part of the Union troops. And there was a Union general named Joe Hooker. His nickname was Fighting Joe Hooker. He and his troops fought that battle and they ended up retreating. But in the Battle of Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson, the famous Southern general who was a hero in the South, was accidentally killed by his own men. We call that friendly fire. When you're accidentally killed by your own men in battle, you're killed by friendly fire. And so that Stonewall Jackson's death really hurt the morale of the South because they lost their hero, their one of their favorite generals. After that battle, General Lee decided to move his troops out of Virginia and invade the North. And that was a gamble. That's why I have Lee's gamble on the outline. So he focused on Pennsylvania. And he was hoping to use the railroads in Pennsylvania and seize northern supplies. And so in July of 1863, Lee's army moved north. And this is where we're going to have the famous Battle of Gettysburg in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on July 1st through 3rd, 1863. This is the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. And it's General Lee's army, the Confederacy, versus General George Meade, the Union general. On the third day of this battle, some of Lee's forces charged the Union line, and they were easy targets for the Union Army. And Lee had a devastating loss after the Battle of Gettysburg. He lost around 7,000 soldiers, and he had to retreat back to the South. So that battle is a very important battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, because it was a turning point in the war. It turned the tide in the war. The South lost so many men in that battle. They were never able to recover. They were weaker than they had been before. To lose thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers and then not be able to rebuild your army really put the South at a disadvantage. And the South was never again able to invade the North. They never were really prepared to invade the North again. So that's the turning point in the war where the North starts to win the war. All right, let's look at the last few battles. In the late spring 1863, General Grant moved about 75,000 Union troops south, and he attacked Vicksburg, Virginia, through the Battle of Vicksburg. That was a battle that lasted several weeks, and the South, Vicksburg, surrendered in early July 1863, and the North won the city of Vicksburg. That battle, along with other battles, gave Ulysses S. Grant a good reputation, and in 1864, Lincoln named Grant the new General in Chief of the Union troops. And that's how Ulysses S. Grant became the General in Chief of the Union troops. In the spring of 1864, Grant joined his forces with another Union general, Meade, to defeat the Southern General Robert E. Lee. Meanwhile, there was another Union Northern general named William Sherman who was ordered to move to Atlanta, Georgia, capture the city of Atlanta, and destroy the Southern Railroad there. And in September of 1864, Sherman's army invaded and captured the city of Atlanta. Then, Sherman wanted to teach the South a lesson, so he moved his troops through Georgia and up into South Carolina by January 1865, and this is known as Sherman's March. Everywhere Sherman's army went, they burned and destroyed everything in their path. That wasn't what he was ordered to do. That was what Sherman decided to do on his own to kind of teach the South a lesson. And they burned homes, they burned cities, they ruined crops, they ruined people's, livelihoods. They ruined the railroad everywhere they went. So, one of the things they did was they would pull up the railroad tracks and they would wrap the tracks around trees. That was called a Sherman necktie. And that way the South couldn't put the railroad tracks back together easily because all the railroad tracks were ruined. So Sherman's march did a lot of devastation, especially in Georgia, but also in some parts of the Carolinas. And when the Confederate armies learned about Sherman's march, a lot more of them deserted to go home, especially if they were from Georgia, to defend their homes and their lands and their families. And so by March of 1865, General Lee had a much smaller army. And he ended up getting surrounded by Grant's larger army in April in Virginia. And on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. So we end up having General Lee's surrender, the Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. The Civil War is over. But the North is not going to celebrate for very long. So in my next video, we're going to look at Lincoln's assassination, President Johnson, and the beginning of the Reconstruction era. So I'll see you then.